introduce yourself and take over with the slides.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for the invitation, Claire. Nice to see everybody. I know some of you, but not all of you. So I'm Adrian Whittington, National Lead for Psychological Professions, and I work across NHS England and Health Education England to provide that sort of national professional leadership for the 12 disciplines, which, of course, as we will, I'm sure on this call all know, is 4 types of psychologist, 5 types of psychotherapist and counsellor, and 3 types of wellbeing practitioner. So those all sit within that portfolio. So I'm just going to share my slides now. Hopefully people can see that. Wave if you can't. Great. So I'm going to be talking a bit about some of the work we've been doing nationally on new roles, and this segment is titled Developing Governance Processes, which sounds incredibly boring and like the kind of cold hand of doom. But really, I hope what you'll take from this session is more of a sense of how we might work together regionally and nationally to ensure that there's really good join up and that we maximise the potential of new roles in the psychological professions in particular. So what I'm going to be talking about probably for about the next 15 minutes or so of the session, and then we'll open it out for discussion and questions, is this. So some of the opportunities and risks around new roles, just to mention the HE New Roles programme and the guidance that HE has on the development of new roles. How do the psychological professions fit into all of this? And then what have we developed in terms of a process around national adoption of or learning from local and regional innovation in psychological professions new roles? So that's the plan. So why do we want to think about new roles at all? Well, I'm sure we would all have really interesting answers to that. Some of the answers I think are these. So implementing new roles can really help us address a sort of workforce gap or need. They can help us meet a patient need potentially more efficiently, sometimes more quickly, sometimes more sustainably than we do with established roles. They can create sort of bridges that offer attractive career progression and a more coherent career path. They can help to increase workforce retention by offering opportunities for people that otherwise weren't there. However, there are some risks, and the sort of proliferation of new roles in a kind of uncoordinated way does have potential to destabilize existing roles. It can put a strain on infrastructure, particularly supervision. Apologies. It can potentially push people into roles where they might be isolated, they might be frustrated, they don't really fit into a system that's ready for them. And all in all, this could end up being a sort of unsustainable role for people if we don't get it right. So about 4 years ago now, HE, as many of you will be aware, established a mental health new roles programme. It's really worth looking at the HE web content on this because there's a lot of very good resources on here. A number of groups were established to look at how new roles could be rolled out to better effect and have a greater impact, particularly in mental health, because there were a number of developments, things like nursing associates, physician associates, pharmacy technicians would be some of those, where really a lot of the kind of focus had been on landing these in acute healthcare, in acute hospitals and community services. In physical health, and there'd been less attention, as there often is, in the sort of minority subject of mental health. So the aim of this programme was to land some of these new roles into mental health more effectively to make an impact. And as well as focusing on some of those specific new roles that had been sort of already established, there was also coverage of existing roles too, so that I think it was pretty apparent that you couldn't just sort of set up a program that was looking at some of these entirely new roles without seeing how those fit together with existing roles and what the potential of those is. So as part of this programme, there was a psychological professions new roles group established, which I was asked to step in and co-chair with one of the heads of mental health at NHS England. And what we did from this was really use it as a platform to not just look at what might be the potential in psychological professions new roles, but really to highlight the fact that you couldn't look at that without looking at the established psychological professions roles, see how it all fitted together, and quite quickly sort of outing the fact that there hadn't been sort of effective workforce planning for psychological professions in particular across the piece for some time, and that there were a number of issues that needed to be resolved for psychological professions to allow them to make their maximum impact. I'll say a bit more about what this led to in a moment, but it's really well worth digging into this page, which of course covers far more than the psychological professions. So it's very much multidisciplinary. And one of the pieces of work that emerged from this work stream is this document, which is also available on the HE website, which is called Good Practice in New Workforce Roles. And this really establishes some quite helpful principles, I think, in thinking about how new roles should be implemented. So I'd really recommend a look at this as well if new roles is something that you're working on. This paper, though, does explicitly only focus on implementing roles that already exist somewhere. So it's about how does a role that already exists somewhere get implemented somewhere else, or expanded, or how can existing staff be supported to step into a new role or a new area of activity within their role. So it doesn't focus specifically on how do you develop an entirely new role from scratch. So from the new roles group in the psychological professions, we ended up with a bit of a mandate, which was very helpful. And this mandate was to do 4 key things. One was to develop a vision for the psychological professions in England, because there had never been one, I don't think, before. Something that really brings together those 12 groups and creates that kind of collective sense of direction. The second area was to create an integrated workforce plan, so something that plans across the different disciplines rather than within the particular programme strands. The way workforce planning has typically been done is, for example, in the programme strand of IAPT or in the programme strand of children and young people's mental health, rather than thinking about how do all these things connect together. So that was the second part of our mandate. The third part was to undertake a programme of work that would enable the development of training and career paths in the psychological professions to make those more coherent and effective. And the final mandate was to develop the right leadership for the psychological professions at local, system, region and national levels. And we published this mandate and had this signed off to be published within the interim people plan in one of the annexes of that plan, which is very helpful because effectively it set in policy the requirement to deliver on these aspects. And also within that document, it was agreed that there would be a National Psychological Professions Workforce Group established to oversee that work. And this group, I'll say a bit more about so that you can see what that comprises. So just for the sake of all being on the same page, I have mentioned the 12 psychological professions. These are the groups, if you can read that, hopefully you've got a big screen, on the left-hand side of the slide here. So these are the kind of core family of psychological professions in our taxonomy in England. And the reason why that's the core family is that these are the groups that have no other home in a professional leadership structure at national and regional level within the NHS in England. So all of these were kind of groups that were otherwise not connected to a leadership structure. So we've created a leadership structure around them. However, of course, there are many other groups that make an incredibly important contribution to psychological healthcare. So the creative therapies, medical psychotherapy, and you know, in many cases, other mental health professionals also. And so we sort of think of this as the wider psychological professions family in the second column there. And then there are, of course, many other groups beyond this as well, groups that are sort of sitting largely outside of NHS commissioned healthcare. Educational psychologists would be one of those that are also making an important contribution. So the aim of this grouping of the 12 isn't to exclude, but it is about creating a home for those that don't have a home elsewhere in the professional leadership in the system in England. So the workforce group that we established on the back of, and as a next stage from the new roles work, aims to do these things. So it aims to create the national vision. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment, but then support its delivery. And that includes the work streams and projects that fall out of that, delivering that vision. It coordinates the kind of professional guidance and advice across the arm's length bodies. So what it effectively does, it brings together the policy leads for each of the kind of key areas where psychological professions have a particularly big showing. So, for example, psychological therapies for severe mental health problems, IAPT, children and young people's mental health, perinatal, etc., etc. So all the policy leads from those areas sit in this group, along with HE mental health team personnel, along with all of those clinical advisors in the arm's length bodies who happen to be psychological professionals. And so that's the kind of core decision-making group. And then we also have a stakeholder group that spans 13 professional bodies, HEI representatives, all of the PPN chairs are also in that stakeholder group, so that we have that connection to regions. And in the core group and the stakeholder group, we also have experts by experience who are involved in our work. And we have Laura Lee, who's the national lead for expert by experience involvement in the psychological professions, which is fantastic. And so people will have no doubt come across the national vision for the psychological professions. I won't go into it in detail here, but do encourage you to make use of this to help amplify our collective voice. So the vision is to transform lives and communities by extending and embedding psychological knowledge and practice across the whole of health and care. And we have these 5 centres of gravity or planets that are essentially the kind of collective commitments of the psychological professions. And all of this was co-produced with over 2,000 people contributing to both a formal consultation exercise and a series of in-person and online workshops. So these are the 5 centres of gravity: put people first, help our communities to thrive, unite and increase diversity in the psychological professions, make all health and care psychological, and transform and innovate. And if you go to the PPN national website, you'll be able to download all of the detail on this, including the commitments that sit beneath each of these planets. That sets the direction for the work. The wiring diagram here shows where this national workforce group sits in the governance structures of HE and NHSE. I won't run through this in detail, but essentially to say it isn't a formal governance group, but it is a kind of advisory and direction shaping group that is accountable into both of those organisations, NHSE and HEE. So it has a kind of pivotal role in shaping things that then go for formal governance sign-off within the other structures. So that's a long sort of way of saying we do have a structure that sort of oversees and can help shape what happens nationally around new roles in the psychological professions. And here are some of the particular considerations, I think, that we've identified, and I'm sure would be familiar to you in terms of shaping new roles in the psychological profession. So point number 1, that we know that there's a ready supply of people who want to work in the psychological professions from a number of different backgrounds, but including many psychology graduates. There's a huge workforce gap, including for psychologically informed practice, but also more generally in mental health. There's some issues with the current career structure, and we see people sort of undertaking multiple trainings, jumping between roles, sometimes very quickly. This can't be the most efficient way of establishing a career structure, so there's some incoherence there. And many people don't understand the psychological professions, how they fit together, and in fact, the different roles have kind of evolved, and it's not been a sort of designing this from scratch situation where you might have ended up with a more coherent system. We've ended up with a complex landscape with different qualifications, multiple bodies regulating both training and individual registration. And to be quite frank, many people in the sort of regional and national systems, you wouldn't expect people to be able to get their head around all of it. So it's very helpful to be able to sort of provide advice on that to help shape it. And the sort of risks that are specific, I think, to the psychological professions' new roles, or particularly present here, are there is a risk of duplicating roles. There's a lot of really good innovation trying to solve some of the same problems in different ways in different places, but this could potentially add to confusion. There's the issue I've already mentioned about repeated training paths, people undertaking a PWP training, for example, and then during that training jumping into clinical psychology training. This is sort of not uncommon. Some of the roles having a very unclear career progression, and a sort of wishful thinking that people will want to stay in a band 5 role forever, whereas of course people will want to progress their pay and opportunities, but we haven't really proactively addressed that as much as we could have done. And in some cases, inadequate professional oversight and governance of the establishment of new roles. So these are some of the things that point us towards really needing some kind of helpful process that can oversee how new roles roll out nationally in the psychological professions, to really try and address some of these risks. So in the new role in the National Psychological Professions Workforce Group, we've established a number of criteria, and these aren't criteria for anyone to set up a new role, because of course there will be excellent local innovation in new roles, and that is something that we want to support. But this is really a set of criteria about how we would work out whether any new roles innovations, perhaps in a region or a local area, would be kind of great to adopt on a sort of wider scale, or whether we can learn from that new role innovation or pilot in order to inform practice around new roles at a wider scale. So these are the sort of criteria that we've established through the group, and we're basically using these to look at where there is innovation in a new role. Is this something that HEE nationally would want to scale up and support on a wider basis, or is there something we can learn from this to inform wider developments? So these are the criteria. I'll just run through each of them briefly. So does the new role meet a workforce gap or need, which is aligned in some way to current policy objectives, in other words, the long-term plan? Is this a role that's emerged that is substantially different from other roles already in the system? In other words, does it unhelpfully duplicate something that's already out there that could have perhaps been tweaked slightly? Is there a set of competencies that are linked to the workforce need or gap? Is there a national curriculum or course accreditation framework that establishes quite clearly what would be delivered as the education and training component if it was to be scaled up? Are there good governance arrangements in practice, including supervision, the professional leadership that would oversee the role, accreditation, training, registration of the individuals, access to CPD and career progression? And then would widespread adoption integrate meaningfully with existing roles rather than primarily disrupt them? And the final one for the sort of gateway of would we want to adopt this would be, would widespread adoption create a good return on public investment? So in other words, the role might look great and might fit all the other criteria, but if we're paying people £1 million to do the job, it's probably not going to be a good return on public investment. If the training is hugely expensive, similarly, there may be an issue there. So those are the sort of gateway requirements for looking at the new role. And it's worth saying, of course, local innovation won't always meet all of these. Why would a local innovation have a national curriculum? So the expectation isn't that all local innovations will meet all of these criteria. This is about how do you scale something up. And if something a role does meet this sort of these criteria, and there's a desire to scale it up, there would then be an ongoing requirement for a quality assurance oversight group within the arm's length bodies that sponsors and governs its development, so that there can be that sort of coordination aspect across the whole of England. Okay, I don't have many more slides, but just to say how this is being implemented. So when a new role is proposed or piloted locally, essentially what we've done so far is undertake a collaborative process with members of the National Psychological Professionals Workforce Group and the people who know the most about the implementation of the role and the training linked to it, to look at the role against these criteria and to have a sort of collaborative review of that. There's then two ways this could go. One is, thank you very much and good luck with the local sort of innovation. This looks like it meets a local need, but it's not something that we'd want to look at for wider rollout. Or there might be sort of actions and adjustments to be made, which then could lead to the role being taken forward for national adoption. And of course, not all local innovations are intended to lead to a national adoption. That's the other thing to say. So there's no sort of requirement to go through this process. It's really about what would make sense to adopt at a wider scale. So what we've taken through this process already are two roles that were already up and running that were sort of policy driven: children's wellbeing practitioners and education mental health practitioners. We've also undertaken this review with clinical associate in psychology and with the Northwest pilot on associate psychological practitioners. So I can say more about those if people are interested. So I think that sets out what some of the kind of processes and thinking is.